Hey, Jaywalkers. It's me, the cyborg princess, filling in for JJ. And we are doing things a little bit different this month, which is why this episode is so late. We had to figure out where to cut it, and this is definitely going to be a two-parter. So I'm going to just jump right into it. The First Amendment in its entirety reads: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of people peaceably to assemble, or to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Less than a paragraph holds much of what we idolize as America. But what does it mean? Like me, you've probably heard people say something violates their First Amendment rights or their right to free speech. But that's what we wanted to cover this month. Now, this is a pure information episode rather than about opinions. So, we kept this research to a couple of sources. There are certainly some parts that may become episodes later because people have such intense feelings about it. But this is what the First Amendment covers according to the Middle Tennessee State University's Free Speech Center. The five freedoms the First Amendment protects: speech, religion, press, assembly, and the right to petition the government. Together, these five guaranteed freedoms make the people of the United States of America the freest in the world. I almost want to say, with these powers combined. Total Captain Planet reference there, but it's okay. Anyways, before agreeing to accept the Constitution, the founders of our democratic republic demanded that these freedoms be protected by an amendment to the original document, the First Amendment. There's no legal age you have to reach to exercise your First Amendment freedoms. They are guaranteed to you the day you're born. There is also no citizenship requirement for First Amendment protection. If you're in the US, you have the freedom of speech, religion, press, assembly, and petition. The First Amendment is neither left wing or right wing. It can be used to push for social and political change or to oppose change. The First Amendment is for everyone. The First Amendment protects us against government limits on our freedom of expression, but it doesn't prevent a private employer from setting its own rules. The First Amendment prevents the government from requiring you to say something you don't want to, or keeping you from hearing or reading the words of others. That means that even if you never speak out yourself, you have the right to receive information. Students have the right to pray in American public schools. As long as there's no as long as there's no disruption to school operations and no government employees, such as teachers or coaches, are involved. That means teachers and coaches cannot lead the prayers, but students can. Which is a nice quick summary, but let's go a little deeper. Freedom of speech is the most readily recognized of the five freedoms in the First Amendment, and the only one that's known by a majority of Americans. That's not a surprise. It's also the First Amendment freedom that most of us use every day and all day. Like the other guarantees in the Bill of Rights, our right to speak freely protects us from limits by the government. It does not, however, prevent rules limiting our speech in other settings. For example, an employer can tell an employee what not to say in the workplace. A condominium association can remove a sign on a resident's front lawn if it's in violation of bylaws. A private business can eject a customer engaged in what it regards as disruptive speech. Free speech protection against government interference is not limited to the spoken word. The government is barred from limiting communication in many different settings, including the presentation of visual art, performances, songs, poetry, and film. They're not limited to one song. They can't limit it. They can't limit a whole majority of songs. Sorry about that. Plural. Songs is plural. Protected speech can also be embodied in symbols. That doesn't specifically say anything, but convey a point of view. Principles of free speech stretch back centuries, as far as ancient Greece. Early codification of freedom of speech can be found in the English Parliament's Bill of Rights, passed in 1689, an act declaring the rights and liberties of the subject and settling the succession of the crown. The bill was highly influential in the drafting of the United States Bill of Rights in 1791, roughly a century later. The latter half of the 20th century was a particularly robust era for the expansion and strengthening of free speech rights, thanks to both shifting judicial attitudes and the emergence of new technologies and platforms. Among key free speech decisions, the free speech right to dissent, political speech, comments about political figures and circumstances have strong protection under the First Amendment, permitting often provocation, actions, and speech in the name of dissent. Brandenburg v. Ohio, 1969. The Supreme Court ruled that advocacy of illegal conduct and is protected as free speech unless it is directed in inciting or producing imminent lawless action and is likely to incite or produce such action. General advocacy of illegal acts in the future cannot be punished. Texas versus Johnson, 1989. The Supreme Court invalidated a Texas law prohibiting flag desecration, concluding that the burning or desecration of a flag for expressive purposes is protected as free speech under the First Amendment. Citizens United versus FEC 2010. The Supreme Court struck down restrictions on corporations spending funds for advocacy and influencing the potential outcomes of elections. This established the right of corporations to engage in political speech. The First Amendment does not allow political speech restrictions based on a speaker's corporate identity. Justice Anthony Kennedy wrote for the majority. The decision is arguably the most controversial First Amendment ruling of the 21st century and is often decried as enabling corruption in government. The free speech rights of students, young people, also have First Amendment rights, tests of which usually arise in public schools. West Virginia Board of Education v. Barnett, 1943. The Supreme Court ruled that public school students could not be compelled to recite the Pledge of Allegiance, affirming that freedom of speech also means the freedom not to speak. The case also established that students have some level of First Amendment protection. Tinker v. Des Moines Independent Community School District, 1969. The Supreme Court found that public school students were wrongly suspended after wearing black armbands to protest the war in Vietnam. Students have First Amendment rights, the court noted, and established that school administrators and teachers can't limit students' free expression unless they reasonably determine that the expression will sustainably disrupt school operations or violate the rights of others. Limits on obscene content. Although many conflate obscenity with pornography, the latter is actually protected by the First Amendment. The Supreme Court has had to grapple with defining legally obscene content. Miller v. California, 1973. Obscene content is not protected by the First Amendment, but not all sexually oriented content is obscene. In this case, the Supreme Court created a three-part test for determining whether content is legally obscene, whether the average person applying contemporary community standards would find that the work, taken as a whole, appeals to the prurient interest, whether the work depicts or describes in a patently offensive way sexual conduct specifically defined by the applicable state law, and whether the work, taken as a whole, lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. There are also cases involving non traditional media and the internet. Joseph Burstyn v. Wilson, 1952. In striking down a New York ban on the public showing of a film entitled The Miracle, the Supreme Court concluded the government may not limit sacrilegious speech and that film is protected by the First Amendment. Reno v. American Civil Liberties Union, 1997, in striking down provisions of the 1996 Communications Decency Act, CDA, as violations of free speech rights, the Supreme Court concluded that content on the internet in the United States has the same level of protection as print publications and other physical media. Brown v. Entertainment Merchants Associations, 2011. The Supreme Court invalidated a California law that criminalized the sale of violent video games to minors, concluding that the depiction of violence is not legally obscene and that First Amendment protections apply. Freedom of the press. This freedom protects the right to gather information and report it to others. While at the time of ratification in 1791, the Free Press Clause addressed newspapers, it now applies to all forms of news gathering and reporting, independent of medium. Television, radio, and online journalists are protected even though they don't use printing presses. The nation's founders believed a free press to be one of the basic freedoms necessary for a new democratic society. They acknowledged that belief in state charters and constitutions, and ultimately in a set of amendments, the Bill of Rights, to the U.S. Constitution that guaranteed certain rights to citizens and states. Freedom of the press remains a precious and vital liberty, ensuring that people can criticize public officials, expose government corruption, and distribute materials on virtually any subject imaginable, free from most prior restraints and other forms of censorship. It is notable that though 18th century newspapers were often highly biased and often irresponsible in their claims, the nation's leaders saw protection of the press as a valuable check on potential corruption and official misdeeds. Freedom of the press guaranteed the voice of the people. Throughout the nation's history, newspapers have been the medium through which Americans have most fully realized the ideal of a free press. In his 1893 book, The Making of the Newspaper, Melville Phillips wrote a plain-spoken yet eloquent description of a newspaper that applies equally well to new media of today. It looks so cheap and, when one has gleaned the news from it, so worthless. Certainly the makings of it does not seem to have cost much in time, labor, brains, or money. But the influence of American journalism reaches into every American home. A popular newspaper is, in a sense, the voice of the people. In a totalitarian society, secret trials and imprisonments often are major tools of repression. In a democratic society, a free press is positioned in virtually every community in every state to keep watch on the local government, police, the courts, and the criminal justice system. A press that is not controlled by the government sits in the nation's courtrooms as a guardian and watchdog over the people's rights to an independent judiciary, a fair trial, and equal protection under the law. Over the course of American history, newspapers did not represent all readers, but diversity came from specialized newspapers and journals that met the needs of ethnic, religious, and racial groups. The anti slavery North Star, created in 1847 by Frederick Douglass, El Clamor Publico, published by Francisco Ramirez beginning in 1855, and the Jewish Daily Forward, begun in 1897 by Russian emigre Abraham Kahan, are just a few of the first examples that gave voice to groups of Americans outside of so-called mainstream. Key First Amendment decisions about freedom of the press. The First Amendment that we know today largely emerged from pivotal U.S. Supreme Court decisions in the 20th century. The First Amendment wasn't thought to apply to the states until the 1925 case, Skidlow v. New York, in which the U.S. Supreme Court found that the freedom of press and speech applied to the states through the 14th Amendment. This also set the stage for the incorporation of other amendments to apply to the states. Among the cases that clarified and expanded the scope of the First Amendment rights, Neer v. Minnesota, 1931, in which the court rejected the notion of prior restraint on publication and decided that freedom of the press applied to the state via the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. Goshteen v. American Press Co., 1936, in which the court struck down a license tax that applied differentially to newspapers with large circulation in Louisiana. New York Times Co. v. Solomon, 1964, in which the court held the press is largely free from any adverse act or court action if it attempts truthfully to report news of public concern, and when the news involves a public official, even erroneously reportage has a high degree of protection. Miami Herald Publishing Co. v. Tornillo, 1974, which struck down a state law requiring newspapers to publish replies to articles criticizing political candidates. Richmond Newspapers, Inc. v. Virginia, 1980, in which the court affirmed a First Amendment right for both the public and the press to attend criminal trials. New York Times Co. v. United States, 1971, the Pentagon Papers case, in which the court reiterated the strong presumption against prior restraint of publication and rejected the Nixon administration's attempt to block the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other papers from printing largely historical documents about U.S. involvement in Vietnam, even though the government cited national security concerns. The Pentagon Papers decision was particularly significant because it showed that the court was willing to protect freedom of the press from infringement by the national executive asserting claims of national security. The justices indicated that the First Amendment ruled out prior restraint of almost all publications other than those that posed a direct threat to ongoing military operations, such as publicizing the location or movement of troops. But several justices observed that the government was not precluded from prosecuting journalists following publication. Individuals might be prosecuted for publishing materials that were obscene or libelous, or for procuring such materials illegally. The prosecution of Daniel Ellsberg, who was leaking the Pentagon Papers, was eventually thwarted when it was discovered that the government had sullied its own hands by illegally breaking into his psychiatrist's office. The failure of the Ellsberg case does not preclude the possibility that once journalists publish, they might still be prosecuted for violating court orders, illegally obtaining materials, or for violating the Espionage Act. Journalists in the early 21st century may yet face such an outcome. Of all these decisions, the most critical to daily news reporting in America was the New York Times v. Sullivan case. Libel lawsuits have the potential to decimate news organizations, particularly if a state law sets a very low threshold for actionable harm. The decision established a higher bar for prevailing against journalists, who had made errors but who acted in good faith. In cases involving public officials, a court will examine whether journalists knew the reporting was false or showed a reckless disregard of the facts. The importance of the New York Times v. Solomon decision can't be overstated. It gives journalists some breathing room to aggressively cover public officials who otherwise might sue them into bankruptcy or silence. In recent years, many politicians and public officials have suggested that New York Times v. Sullivan should be overturned, finding sympathy from at least two Supreme Court justices. Both Justice Clarence Thomas and Justice Neil Gorsuch noted in 2019 that these decisions should be reconsidered. What started in 1964 with a decision to tolerate the occasional falsehood to ensure robust reporting by a comparative handful of print and broadcast outlets has evolved into an ironclad subsidy for the publication of falsehoods by means and on a scale previously unimaginable, Gorsuch wrote. In a letter to Edward Carrington in 1787, Thomas Jefferson argued that the good sense of the American people is always going to be the greatest asset of the American government. Sometimes they might go astray, but they have the ability to right themselves. The people should always have the media to express opinions through. Jefferson's letter then continued, the basis of our government being the opinion of the people, the very first object should be to keep that right. And were it left to me to decide whether we should have the government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter. The idea of a free press predates the founding of the United States. Many scholars trace the first expression of the concept to a free press in the English speaking world to John Milton's Areopagitica, a speech he wrote in 1644 to persuade the English Parliament to repeal a licensing act enacted a year earlier. Milton argued that the benefits of the vigorous public debate far outweigh the dangers to society of unregulated public discourse, a theory that still has currency today. In the American rationale for a free press, Milton's concept was characterized by others, such as U.S. Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., as the marketplace of ideas, a sphere in which the truth would naturally assert itself over untruthful if left uncensored or otherwise limited by authority. In the early American Republic, most newspapers were highly partisan mouthpieces. The founders provided constitutional protection in the Bill of Rights for the new media of their day, newspapers. Even as many of the publications roasted these political figures in terms that would make today's supermarket tabloid reports seem lame. In time, these partisan rags were overtaken by mass circulation magazines and metropolitan newspapers as press owners became more competitive and sought to build a mass audience for their publications. These formats were later joined by the broadcast media, radio and television, and still later by internet and digital media. From the journals of opinion to the mass circulation penny press, to thousands of local dailies and weeklies of the national newspaper and companies' websites, newspapers have been relied upon by Americans to learn and weather forecasts, document the workings of public officials, help roust scoundrels, hold the powerful accountable, and, for individuals as well as the nation, celebrate triumphs and record moments of tragedy. Critics and supporters alike are fond of saying that newspapers are just the first draft of history. But for most citizens, that draft covers the most important moments of personal history. Birth announcements, about stories about youth sports or academic success, graduation lists, marriage announcements, sometimes followed by divorce legal notices and obituaries, and real stuff of real lives. An initial step in determining the vital role of the free press in society came in 1735 when a printer, John Peter Zenger, my apologies, I'm mispronouncing the name, went on trial for seditious libel. He had published a newspaper, the New York Weekly Journal, with articles critical of the government and specifically of William Cosby, the colonial governor of New York. Printers in the New World had, for a number of years, been battling British colonial officials, contending with the king's power of license, and thereby control. Newspapers no longer applied. Zenger was brought to trial. He was defended successfully when his lawyer, Andrew Hamilton, convinced the jury that Zenger ought not to be punished for printing what was true, even though truth was not then a defense to libel claims. The role and right of a free press have been tested many times, even as the founders created the free press provision of the First Amendment. Some continued to believe that government needed to control or exert influence over some publications. Government acts, powerful officials, and even rioting mobs would at times attempt to limit or tax newspapers and intimidate editors and reporters. In 1798, a Federalist Party dominated Congress, passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. The laws empowered John Adams' Federalist administration to act against non-citizens it deemed dangerous, and provided for criminal charges against Americans who print, utter, or publish any false, scandalous, and malicious writing or writings against the government of the United States, or either House of the Congress of the United States, or the President of the United States. Some journalists, especially those who supported the Jefferson Democratic Republican Party, were jailed under the Sedition Act. Jefferson's campaign in 1800 was based in part on the defense of a free press and against the acts, which Congress later allowed to expire. When Jefferson took office, he pardoned individuals who had been imprisoned under the law. Within a few decades of Jefferson's victory, the idea of a mass press began to take hold, prompted by the growth of cities, changes in printing technologies, and the growth of literacy and the popular franchise. Government officials, however, often believed it necessary to censor the press during times of crisis. During the Civil War, newspapers across the nation were providing news of the government policy and reporting from the battlefield, sometimes to the consternation of President Abraham Lincoln, who moved to censor news reports carried by telegraph. As Lincoln, as well as other wartime presidents who followed, found, newspaper readers wanted all the news from the front, good and bad. Sometimes just the news was not enough. Editor William Story, famed for coining the slogan, "A newspaper's duty is to print the news and raise hell," cabled his Civil War correspondents, "Telegraph fully all the news, and when there is no news, send rumors." In the late 19th century, William Randolph Hearst's newspaper played a part in propelling the nation into the Spanish-American War. But wartime also had afforded the press a more positive role, keeping the nation informed in time of conflict, independent of the government. Wartime had brought forth some of the newspaper's most compelling writing, from early correspondents at the front lines in World War II, correspondents like Ernie Pyle, to reports from embedded journalists accompanying U.S. military forces in Iraq. The Free Press reported about conflict even before the Revolution. In addition to written reports, woodcut images of redcoats firing on civilians in Boston were circulated throughout the colonies. These news reports helped solidify sentiment and still divided American opinion about breaking with Great Britain. Most Americans have heard of the battle in which General George Custer and his troops were killed at Little Bighorn, but not many may know that, as documented in the museum's book Crusaders, Scoundrels, Journalist, reporter Mark Kellogg of the Bismarck ND Tribune was killed in 1876 alongside with General Custer and 210 troops of the 7th U.S. Cavalry. Kellogg had responded to an Associated Press request for a volunteer news reporter to go alongside with Custer. Much of the First Amendment's protection of the free press was established in law during the 20th century by a series of U.S. Supreme Court decisions. In an overview of the Free Press Clause that he published for the First Amendment Center, media law attorney Lee Levine noted the development of a bundle of rights for the press that developed through these decisions. These rights established that the government may not prevent the publication of a newspaper, even when there is reason to believe that it is about to reveal information that will endanger our national security. Levine observed that precedents have also established that government may not pass a law that requires newspapers to publish information against their will, impose criminal penalties or civil damages on the publication of truthful information about a matter of public concern, or even the dissemination of false and damaging information about a public person except in rare instances, impose taxes on the press that it does not levy on other businesses, compel journalists to reveal, in most circumstances, the identities of their sources, or prohibit the press from attending judicial proceedings and thereafter informing the public about them. First Amendment Center scholar Ronald K. L. Collins has written, "A free press is one of the bulwarks of a free society. Without it, there can be no consent of the governed, no informed decision making, and no check on the abuse of power. One of the vital roles of the press is to encourage citizens to participate in government by keeping them fully informed about life, law, politics, economics, and other things that matter." Collins relates the words of Justice Potter Stewart wrote in 1972. "Enlightened choice by informed citizenry is the basic ideal upon which an open society is premised, and a free press is thus indispensable to a free society." With greater opportunity for a free press in an age of internet communication, social media, and blogosphere and desktop publishing, and with more voices speaking freely across more media than at any other time in U.S. history, Americans are being challenged with new questions on the state of free press. Citizens are being asked to balance the value of the freedom of a largely unrestrained press against potential national security concerns, of the need for an informed public against growing worry over personal privacy, of the value of the press as government watchdog against fears about public safety and challenges to personal values by freely available online content and commentary. How Americans respond to those questions and those fears will determine the definition of a free press in the 21st century, and whether the marketplace of ideas continues to function as independently as it has throughout most of American history. Then we have the freedom of assembly and association. The First Amendment guarantees the right of the people peacefully to assemble. The notion that the act of gathering is pivotal to a functioning democracy democracy relates to the belief that individuals espousing ideas will tend to coalesce around their commonalities. As a result, a correlative right of association, though not enumerated in the First Amendment, evolved from the right of assembly and continues to be recognized in a growing body of case law. It also can be viewed more broadly as a corollary to the right of speech because people often bond together in speech related activities. That's a lot of fancy words just to say you have a right to get together. In the 1930s, the Supreme Court weighed in on the of assembly, recognizing that the right to gather collectively as one voice advanced benefits warranting constitutional protection. In DeJong v. Oregon, 1937, the court made clear that the right of peaceable assembly is a right cognate to those of free speech and free press and is equally fundamental. In the case before the court, Dirk DeJong had been charged under an Oregon criminal syndicalism statute because he had assisted in the conduct of a meeting which was called under the auspices of the Communist Party, an organization advocating criminal syndicalism. During his speech at the gathering, DeJong protested against conditions in the county jail, the action of city police in relation to the maritime strike then in progress in Portland, and numerous other matters. In his defense, DeJong stated that the meeting was held in public. It was orderly and no unlawful conduct was taught or advocated at the meeting by him or anyone else. In fact, the court unfavorably noted that under the Oregon statute, essentially anyone who joined in the assembly, even for purely lawful purposes, could be charged. Also, as the court observed, the Oregon law might be indefinitely extended to every variety of meeting under the auspice of the Communist Party, although held for the discussion of political issues or to adopt protests and pass resolutions of an entirely innocent and proper character. Discourse would clearly suffer if individuals feared prosecution for merely joining in a discussion with an unpopular group without any attempt to further illegal action. As the court concluded, the right of assembly is one that cannot be denied without violating those fundamental principles of liberty and justice which lie at the base of all civil and political institutions. Principles which the 14th Amendment embodies in the general terms of its due process clause. In short, the court shored up the protection that the Constitution provides to those individuals and groups that espouse views repugnant to a democratic society. If principles of association are embedded in the right of assembly, should there also be a right for a group to exclude from membership those individuals that do not fit the group's desired mission or profile? The Supreme Court began looking at the issue in 1984 when it examined whether the JCs, a group that admitted as regular members only men between the ages of 18 and 35, violated Minnesota's Human Rights Act, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of gender and race. Two local chapters of the JCs claimed that the national organization's bylaws illegally discriminated against women. The national organization argued that its right of association would be violated if forced to admit women. Justice William J. Brennan Jr., writing for the court in Roberts v. United States JCs, 1984, found that the court had traditionally viewed freedom of association in two distinct ways. In one respect, individuals who choose to enter into and maintain certain intimate human relationships must be secured against undue intrusion by the states because of the role of such relationships in safeguarding the individual freedom that is central to our constitutional scheme. This type of association recognized that certain kinds of personal bonds have played a critical role in the culture and traditions of the nation by cultivating and transmitting shared beliefs, ideals, and beliefs. Examples include rights attendant to marriage and procreation. Under these circumstances, association is a fundamental element of personal liberty. In another respect, associational rights should be viewed as existing for the purpose of engaging in those activities protected by the First Amendment: speech, assembly, petition for redress of grievance, and the exercise of religion. In these instances, association is an indispensable means of preserving other liberties. Of significance, the scope of protection for association may vary depending upon which associational interests are at stake. The court rejected intimate association as the applicable principle in Roberts because the charters of the JC were large and basically unselective groups. In fact, the group routinely admitted anyone who met the age and gender requirements. The court's analysis turned consequently to whether the Minnesota Act interfered with the JC's expressive association rights, which enabled activities protected by the First Amendment. In this regard, Brennan wrote, the court has long understood as implicit in the right to engage in activities protected by the First Amendment a corresponding right to associate with others in pursuit of a wide variety of political, social, economic, educational, religious, and cultural ends. This type of association requires a balancing to determine whether the government has a compelling interest unrelated to the suppression of ideas that would justify an incursion. In this instance, the court was persuaded that Minnesota's interest in eliminating gender discrimination was sufficient to justify the impact that application of the statute to the JCs may have on the male members' associational freedoms. Despite the court's ruling in Roberts and other similar cases, claims of discrimination do not always trump associational rights. In Hurley v. Irish American Gay, Lesbian, and Bisexual Group of Boston, 1995, the court issued a ruling for a situation in which the message of one group conflicted with that of the other. In this case, pursuant to a grant of authority by the city of Boston, the South Boston Allied War Veterans Council, a private group, had been allowed to sponsor and organize the annual St. Patrick's Day Evacuation Day parade. Another group, comprised of gay, lesbian, and bisexual descendants of Irish immigrants, sought to march in a parade under a banner identifying its members as such and expressing pride and solidarity with similar marchers in New York's parade. The parade sponsors denied the group's application to participate, and the group filed suit, alleging violation of the state and federal constitutions and Massachusetts public accommodations law prohibiting discrimination at public events. The Supreme Court was not sympathetic to the gay organization's contention that Massachusetts law required the parade sponsor to include the group despite its lack of affinity with the message, observing it boils down to the choice of the speaker not to propound a particular point of view, and that choice is presumed to lie beyond the government's power to control. In support of its ruling, the court observed, parades are thus a form of expression, not just motion, and the inherent expressiveness of marching to make a point explains our cases involving protest marches. Parsed differently, here the parade sponsor's right of expression association was paramount. According to the court, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts should not interfere to require the sponsor to associate with a view to which it did not subscribe. Another case involving the associative rights of a private organization and a gay member, the Supreme Court similarly ruled that the Boy Scouts of America had the right to exclude a gay assistant scoutmaster. The Boy Scouts had revoked the membership of James Dale, an Eagle Scout, after they discovered that he was homosexual and an activist for gay causes. The Scouts organization maintained that homosexual conduct is inconsistent with the values it seeks to instill. Dale sued using New Jersey's public accommodation law. In Boy Scouts of America v. Dale 2000, the court did not agree with Dale's argument that not all members of the Boy Scouts organization supported its anti-gay stance, finding instead that the Boy Scouts takes an official position with respect to homosexual conduct, and that is sufficient for First Amendment purposes. The court further found that the Boy Scouts were an expressive association and that the forced inclusion of Dale would significantly affect its expression. Organizations are entitled to develop their own messages. As the court concluded, we are not, as we must not be, guided by our views of whether the Boy Scouts' teachings with respect to homosexual conduct are right or wrong. Public or judicial disapproval of a tenet of an organization's expression does not justify the state's effort to compel the organization to accept members where such acceptance would derogate from the organization's expressive message. More recently, the court rejected an argument by colleges and universities that their rights of expressive association were violated by the Solomon Amendment, a congressional statute forcing them either to allow military recruiters on campus or relinquish federal funding. In Rumsfeld v. Forum for Academic and Institutional Rights, 2006, the court dismissed the notion that because the military excludes known homosexuals from its ranks, requiring a school to grant them access to campus for recruiting is tantamount to forcing the educational institutions to endorse a discriminatory message. To the contrary, the court reasoned that recruiters are, by definition, outsiders who come onto campus for the limited purposes to try to hire students, not to become members of the school's expressive association. The educational institutions relied heavily upon the earlier opinion of Dale, but the court saw the issue differently because the military was not part of the schools. Thus, its presence on campus did not affect the school's message. By contrast, in Dale, the assistant scoutmaster was an intricate part of the organization. As the court in Rumsfeld noted, students and the faculty are free to associate to voice their disapproval of the military's message. Nothing about the statute affects the composition of the group by making group memberships less desirable. Although it may be impractical for the educational institutes above to deny access to military recruiters and thus forfeit all federal funding, that choice remains. Yet, at times, individuals cannot separate themselves from a group's message. Moreover, in some instances, the court has upheld that group's ability to require individuals to help finance a message despite their objection to it. And Board of Regents of the University of Wisconsin System v. Southworth, 2000, a group of students at the University of Wisconsin challenged, on First Amendment grounds, the institution's mandatory student activity fee, claiming that the funds were used in part by the university to support student organizations engaging in political and ideological speech. The students objected to being compelled to associate, through the fees they paid, with the expression of certain student organizations with which they disagreed. The court found the purpose of the fee to be noble. The University of Wisconsin exacts the fee at issue for the sole purpose of facilitating the free and open exchange of ideas by and among its students. Justice Anthony M. Kennedy wrote, "The distribution of fees took place by direct application of student referendum. If the objecting students are entitled, as the court suggests, to insist upon certain safeguards with respect to the expressive activities which they are required to support, what workable protections must the university put in place?" The court answered this query by finding the proper measure and the principal standard of protection for objecting students is the requirement of viewpoint neutrality and the allocation of funding support. Although finding that the university's direct application program satisfied viewpoint neutrality, the court was less sanguine with the student referendum process, which was incumbent upon a majority vote. As the court reasoned, the whole theory of viewpoint neutrality is that minority views are treated with the same respect as the majority views. Southworth is distinguishable from earlier precedents in which an objecting individual could not be forced to fund political views on the entire group. Two cases in particular have shaped the law's direction in this area. Abode v. Detroit Board of Education, 1977, and Keller v. State Board of California, 1990. In Abode, non-union public school teachers objected on association grounds to a collective bargaining agreement that required them to pay a service fee equal to the dues union members paid. The court ruled that to the extent that the funds were used to support political candidates or express political views, teachers could prevent the expenditure of a part of their service fees. In Keller, the court ruled similarly in that although required payment of dues to practice law were permissible, lawyers could not be forced to fund the Bar Association's political messages. The right of assembly has largely gone unexamined by the U.S. Supreme Court for decades, despite high profile and widespread protests and the growing militarization of local police forces tasked with monitoring those protests. In 2020, constitutional law attorney Kia Ranama wrote that the Supreme Court was failing to do its duty. For decades, lower level courts ignored requests to apply the chilling effect doctrine to harsh crowd control tactics, finding that advocates plead that such practices can impact future participation in protests to be tenuous. Ranama wrote in Politico, the court's failure to update Americans' understanding of the freedom of assembly has given law enforcement free rein to deploy strategies that increasingly have the potential to deter future participation in protests. So, we've covered freedoms of speech, freedom of press, and freedom of assembly. And we're only halfway through our notes, which means the freedoms of religion and freedom of petition are next month. And we'll do our best to be on time with those. As always, if you have a topic that you would like to suggest, a comment, or a disagreement, please let us know in the comments on Spotify or at jaywalkingthroughlife@gmail.com. Jaywalk, not jaywalking. Someone beat me to it. We'll beat him to it. But I know we covered a lot today. Again, this is going to be a two-parter, guys. There is a lot of crazy going on. So, again, we're likely to cover some more of this more in-depth in future episodes because there's a lot to cover. And we really wanted to cover what is our First Amendment rights. So, with that being said, Jaywalking Through Life is a Hidden Star property, and we're getting out for some more shows. We are going to be at we're going to be at Hidden Star. We are Hidden Star, guys. We're going to be at the Family Cafe this next weekend, and then we're going to be at SharkCon. So if we don't see you there, shame on you. And we'll see you real soon.